It was a giant, untamable horse that no man could break. As they prepared to put it down, a broken-down cowboy stepped forward and gave it a strange, heartbreaking name. Burden. This is the story of how a man had to confront his own past before he could ride into a future worth fighting for. For Ethan Thorne, the sound of hoofbeats was a constant torment. Once, he had been a champion, a jockey whose name whispered of grace and speed on every racecourse from Texas to California. But that was a lifetime ago, before the accident, before Lila. Now, he was just another ranch hand, a shadow of the man he used to be, burying his guilt in endless work on the Jensen Ranch. He had tried to outrun the memories, but they clung to him like burrs in the saddle blanket, a constant crushing burden. He saw horses not with love, but with a deep, aching regret. He saw them, and he saw his sister, Lila, laughing in the stands just moments before. He had come to this dusty auction not by choice, but by obligation, sent by Mr. Jensen to pick up a new mare. The noise, the smells, the jostle of the crowd, it was all a painful reminder of the life he had lost. He tried to stay unnoticed, his gaze fixed on the ground, until a sudden roar of fear and fury ripped through the afternoon heat. All eyes turned to the auction ring. There, thrashing against heavy ropes, was a sight that silenced the murmuring crowd. A magnificent black stallion, a giant beast of muscle and wild fury. Its coat was the color of midnight, its mane and tail a wild, untamed river of silk. But its eyes blazed with a defiance so absolute, so fierce, it struck fear into the hearts of even the most seasoned horsemen. It had already injured 3 men, sending them sprawling in the dust. The auctioneer, a grizzled veteran, wiped sweat from his brow, his voice hoarse with desperation. "She's untamable, folks. A true devil horse. No one can break her. Going once, going twice. Any bids for this wild beast, this shadow? Before we put her down for good." The crowd recoiled. No one dared bid. This wasn't a horse. It was a force of nature, a dangerous, worthless animal. A ranch hand, rifle in hand, began to approach the stallion, preparing to end its wild life. Ethan watched, his own heart pounding, a cold recognition gripping him. He saw the wildness in its eyes, the untamed spirit, and felt a profound, aching connection. This horse, it was a mirror of his own untamed grief, his own roaring, unridden pain. He moved then, without conscious thought, pushing through the stunned crowd. He walked into the center of the ring, ignoring the auctioneer's shouts, ignoring the loaded rifle, ignoring the men who stared at him as if he were mad. He walked directly towards the thrashing, desperate animal, the giant stallion, its eyes rolling wildly, still struggling against its chains, saw him coming. It whinnied, a sound of fury and fear. Ethan stopped just inches from its head, his own face calm amidst the chaos. He looked into the stallion's wild, dark eyes, and in their depths, he saw not just a horse, but a reflection of his own soul, bruised and raging against an inescapable past. He reached out, not to strike, not to tame, but to simply offer a connection. He didn't touch it. He simply spoke, his voice a low, rough whisper, yet it cut through the din of the auction ring, carrying a weight that silenced every man present. "Your name is Burden." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Burden, a name that spoke of heavy loads, of inescapable sorrows. Ethan then turned to the astonished auctioneer, his eyes clear and resolute. "I'll buy her for $1. The auctioneer, stunned, could only nod. The crowd murmured, confused by this strange, heartbreaking exchange. Clara Jensen, the ranch owner's daughter, watched from the edge of the crowd, her hand pressed to her chest. She saw not a madman, but a man wrestling with demons no one else could see. A man who had just named his own pain. Her father, Mr. Jensen, merely shook his head, a look of profound disapproval on his face. He saw only a foolish ranch hand, wasting $1 on a worthless, dangerous animal. But Ethan, looking into the wild, desperate eyes of the stallion he now called Burden, knew he had just bought his own last chance at redemption. His fate and the horse's were now irrevocably intertwined. Ethan brought Burden back to the Jensen ranch, not to the main corrals, but to a secluded pen he had reinforced with extra thick timbers. Mr. Jensen grumbled about the wasted dollar and the danger of keeping such a wild beast. But Clara, his daughter, simply watched, her intelligent eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. She had seen the raw emotion in Ethan's face at the auction and knew there was more to this man and this horse than met the eye. Cole, however, did not try to break the horse. He did not use whips, ropes, or harsh commands. His methods were unlike anything the other ranch hands had ever seen. For days, he simply sat in the corral, a quiet, unmoving presence. He wouldn't even enter the pen. He would sit just outside the fence, sometimes for hours, simply watching Burden. The horse, still chained, would watch him back, its eyes wild and suspicious. Then, he began to speak. His voice, a low, constant murmur, filled the pen. He wasn't giving commands. He was telling stories. He spoke of the wind that carried the dust from the racetracks, the roar of the crowd, the smell of sweat and leather. He spoke of the thrill of victory, the crushing weight of defeat. He spoke of the blur of horses' hooves, the sudden, terrible fall. And he spoke of Lila, his beloved younger sister, whose infectious laughter had filled his life, whose innocent joy had been the only thing that kept him tethered to the ground. He recounted the day of the accident, the split second that had stolen her from him, the agonizing guilt that had consumed him ever since. He wasn't talking to the horse. He was confessing his own buried guilt, his burden, to the only creature he felt understood his wild, untamed grief. He was pouring out the decade of pain he had carried, syllable by silent syllable, into the shared space of the pen. The horse, initially defiant, slowly began to listen. Its ears would swivel. Its eyes, though still wary, would fix on his face. It was a strange, silent communion between two burdened souls. Clara watched this strange ritual unfold day after day. From her window in the ranch house, she saw Ethan's tireless patience, his unwavering presence. She saw the raw, open wound of his grief, glimpsed in the way his shoulders would slump, or the way his voice would break, even when speaking to a horse. She saw the horse, initially a whirlwind of fury, slowly calm under his gaze. It was a dance of trust, slow and agonizing, but undeniably real. No one else on the ranch understood. Her father scoffed, calling Ethan mad, saying he was wasting time on a worthless beast. The other ranch hands murmured about his strange ways. But Clara saw something else. She saw a deep kindness, a profound empathy that transcended human understanding. She saw the horse, Burden, begin to respond. It would no longer thrash against its chains when Ethan entered the pen. It would stand, watching him, its breathing less ragged. It would even approach him cautiously, sniffing at his outstretched, empty hand, before pulling back. It was a fragile truce, born of shared silence and unspoken sorrow. Ethan, for the first time in a decade, felt a tiny spark of something other than regret. He felt a sliver of hope. And as he looked into the horse's deep, knowing eyes, he believed, with a growing certainty, that by taming this wild, burdened spirit, he might, just might, find a way to finally tame his own. A month crawled by, each day a mirror of the last. Ethan's life had become a singular, obsessive focus. The pen, the horse, and the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding trust. He had removed most of the heavy chains, leaving only a simple lead rope, a symbol of the progress they had made. Burden no longer saw him as a threat, but as a constant, predictable presence. A strange, quiet calm had settled over the once chaotic pen, but the final barrier, the barrier of physical contact, remained unbroken. The breakthrough came on a quiet afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground. Ethan was sitting in his usual spot, speaking softly, recounting a childhood memory of him and Lila racing ponies across a meadow. As he spoke, a genuine, bittersweet smile touched his lips. It was the first time he had smiled in what felt like a lifetime. Perhaps it was the change in his tone, the momentary release of his grief. Burden, who had been standing on the far side of the pen, slowly, deliberately walked towards him. Ethan fell silent, his heart pounding in his chest, afraid to move, to breathe, to break the fragile spell. The giant stallion stopped directly in front of him, its massive head just inches from his own. After a long, silent moment of assessment, the horse did something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. It lowered its head and gently, tentatively, nudged his shoulder with its muzzle. It was the first touch, a simple, profound act of acceptance, an invitation. Slowly, so as not to spook the animal, Ethan raised his hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He laid his palm flat against the horse's strong neck. The stallion did not flinch. It simply stood, accepting his touch, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them. In that moment, a decade of crushing weight seemed to lift from Ethan's shoulders. He was not just touching a horse, he was touching hope. Clara had witnessed the entire scene from a distance, her own heart swelling with a profound emotion. She had seen his patience, had heard the distant murmur of his sad stories, and now she had seen the reward. That evening, as Ethan was grooming Burden, a task that was now a quiet ritual of trust, she knew she could no longer remain a silent observer. She walked to the pen, carrying a lantern and a covered plate. The aroma of a hot meal wafted on the cool evening air. It was the first time she had ever approached him here, in his sacred space. He stopped his work, a look of surprise on his face. She simply smiled, a kind, understanding smile that held no pity, only a deep, genuine respect. "I thought, you might be hungry. It's not much, just stew." It was a simple offering, but it was so much more. It was an acknowledgement, an act of fellowship. They ate together, sitting on a bale of hay just outside the pen, the great black horse watching them with calm, intelligent eyes. And for the first time, they had a real conversation. She didn't ask him about the accident, or about Lila, the name she had overheard in his one-sided conversations. Instead, she asked him about the horse. She asked what he saw in Burden's eyes that no one else did. Ethan, finding it easier to speak of the horse's pain than his own, began to open up. He spoke of the wild spirit trapped behind the fear, of the memory of trauma that made it lash out, of the deep-seated need to be understood rather than broken. As he spoke, Clara listened, and she heard the truth. He was not just talking about the horse. He was talking about himself. He, in turn, asked her why she was not afraid of him, like the others. She confessed that she had never believed the rumors, that she had always seen a quiet gentleness in him, a gentleness that was now, for the first time, being allowed to surface. In the soft glow of the lantern, under the watchful eyes of the horse named Burden, two lonely souls, one human and one animal, had found their first touch of grace. And for Ethan, the quiet ranch hand, a new, terrifying, and beautiful feeling began to take root in his heart, a feeling he thought had been buried forever with his sister. It was the beginning of love. The first touch, the first conversation, opened the floodgates. Ethan's progress with Burden accelerated at a remarkable pace. The horse, now free of its chains, responded to his quiet commands and gentle hands with an intelligence and willingness that was astonishing. Within a few more weeks, he was riding him, a slow, careful dance of trust around the pen. Their bond had become the talk of the ranch, a quiet miracle that no one could explain. Ethan's bond with Clara deepened as well. She became a regular visitor to the pen, her calm, supportive presence a balm to his wounded soul. They would talk for hours, their conversations weaving a delicate tapestry of shared hopes and quiet confessions. He was beginning to feel alive again, the heavy cloak of his grief slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to lift. But their budding happiness had not gone unnoticed, and it had bred a dark, resentful jealousy. Silas, the ranch foreman, was a man whose small authority was built on fear and brute force. He had always despised Ethan, seeing his quiet competence as a threat and his past tragedy as a weakness. He watched Ethan's success with Burden and his growing closeness with the boss's daughter with a venomous envy. He saw Ethan's gentle methods as a personal insult to his own brand of violent machismo. He decided it was time to show everyone who the real horseman was. One afternoon, while Ethan and Clara were in town for supplies, Silas and two of his cronies went to the secluded pen. Armed with a cruel whip and sharp spurs, he intended to break the horse the old-fashioned way, to shatter the bond of trust Ethan had so painstakingly built. When Ethan and Clara returned, they were met with a scene of chaos and violence. Burden, terrified and bleeding from a fresh wound on his flank, was thrashing wildly in the pen, his eyes white with a renewed terror. Silas lay on the ground, groaning, his arm clearly broken where the horse had kicked him in self-defense. Clara's father, Mr. Jensen, stood there, his face a mask of cold fury. He had seen only the result, his foreman injured, and the devil horse reverting to its wild, dangerous nature. His patience had finally run out. "That's it, Thorne. I gave you a chance. This beast is a menace. I want it put down. Now." Panic seized Ethan. To lose Burden now, after everything, it was unthinkable. It felt like losing Lila all over again. He pleaded with Mr. Jensen, trying to explain that the horse had been provoked, but the foreman's injury was all the proof the old rancher needed. As a ranch hand went to fetch a rifle, Ethan, in a last, desperate act to save the horse, grabbed Clara's arm, his eyes wild with a pain she had never seen before. He finally confessed everything. This was the plot twist, the reason for his obsession, the secret he had carried like a burning coal in his heart. He told her, his voice ragged with emotion, the full story of the racing accident. He explained how a chain reaction on the track had caused a pileup. His horse had stumbled, and his younger sister, Lila, who had rushed to the railing to see if he was okay, had been struck by another, out-of-control horse. It had all happened in a horrifying instant. And then he revealed the final, heart-stopping piece of the puzzle. The horse that had struck his sister, the one that had galloped away into the chaos, had a distinctive, unusual scar on its flank, a mark he had seen for only a split second but was burned into his memory forever. A perfect, starburst-shaped scar. He pulled back the bloody flap of skin on Burden's flank, where Silas's whip had struck, revealing the old pale scar beneath. It was the same one. A starburst. "It's him, Clara. It's the same horse. Don't you see? I have to save him. Taming him. Forgiving him. It's the only way I can ever forgive myself. He's not just a horse. He is my penance. He is my burden." Clara stared, her own eyes filling with tears. She finally understood. The impossible connection, the strange name, the unwavering patience. It was not just about a horse. It was a pilgrimage. A broken man's desperate, last-ditch attempt to find atonement in the eyes of the very creature that symbolized his greatest failure. Ethan's confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. He stood, vulnerable and exposed, his deepest wound laid bare for all to see. The ranch hand with the rifle shifted uncomfortably, and even Mr. Jensen's hard expression flickered with a momentary, surprised empathy. But for the old rancher, a broken heart did not change the fact that a man had been injured and a horse had proven itself dangerous. Business was business. The animal had to go. He gave the final order, his voice gruff, trying to mask his own discomfort. But before the ranch hand could raise his rifle, Clara stepped forward. She moved to stand directly between the rifle and the horse, her small frame a defiant shield. Her face, usually so gentle, was now set with a fierce, unwavering resolve. She had seen the truth, and she would not let this story end in another tragedy. She turned to her father, her voice clear and strong. She spoke not of Ethan's grief, but of something her father understood far better: business and honor. She reminded him of the ranch's precarious financial situation, the loan that was coming due, the threat of foreclosure that had been a constant worry for months. And then, she proposed the bargain. The all-in gamble for redemption. She told him of the upcoming territorial derby, the biggest horse race of the year, with a prize purse large enough to wipe out all their debts and secure the ranch's future. Her proposal was as mad as it was brilliant. Let Ethan train and ride Burden in that race. Her father laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. Ride that wild, untamed killer in a race? It was suicide. But Clara pressed on, her logic sharp and undeniable. The horse was a thoroughbred, its bloodlines clear in its powerful build and fiery spirit. It had been born for the track. Its wildness was not malice, but a trauma that Ethan, and only Ethan, understood how to heal. Who better to ride a horse born of tragedy than a man who was trying to outrun his own? This, she argued, was not just a chance to save a horse. It was a chance to save the ranch. It was a chance for Ethan to reclaim the honor and skill that had once made him a champion. She looked at Ethan, then back at her father, and laid out the final, brutal terms. One race. If they win, the prize money saves this ranch, and Ethan keeps the horse. He will have earned his place here, and his redemption. If they lose, or if that horse harms a single soul, you can do what you must, and Ethan will leave this valley and my life forever. The bargain was set. It was a desperate, almost impossible challenge. Mr. Jensen, a gambler at heart, looked from his determined daughter to the broken man standing beside the equally broken horse. He saw a glimmer of the champion Ethan once was, a flicker of a fire he thought long extinguished. Against his better judgment, swayed by his daughter's fierce loyalty and the desperate hope of saving his legacy, he agreed. The ranch hand lowered his rifle. Burden had been granted a temporary reprieve, his life now resting on Ethan's ability to turn a symbol of his greatest failure into a champion. As her father and the other men walked away, Clara turned to Ethan. She was no longer just a kind observer. She was his partner, his trainer, his believer. She had defied her own father for him. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch a promise of unwavering support. We will do this, together. And Ethan, looking at this incredible woman, at the horse that carried the ghost of his past, and at the impossible task that lay before them, felt not fear, but a surge of pure, unadulterated purpose. The race for prize money had become a race for their lives, their love, and their souls. It was a race he could not afford to lose. The weeks leading up to the territorial derby were a crucible, a relentless test of will, patience, and faith. The bargain had been struck, and the weight of the entire ranch now rested on the shoulders of a broken man and a traumatized horse. The first days of training were a brutal exercise in frustration. Burden, still spooked from the foreman's attack, was a storm of terror and mistrust. He would rear, buck, and bolt at the slightest provocation, his powerful body a testament to the wild grief he still carried. Ethan, however, refused to meet the horse's violence with his own. He returned to his quiet methods, his voice a constant, calming murmur, his hands gentle and reassuring. But now, he was not alone. Clara was by his side every step of the way. She was not just an observer. She was an active partner. She learned the horse's moods, discovered he was calmed by the scent of fresh apples, and would stand for hours, feeding him slices from her hand, her presence a beacon of gentle, unwavering safety. It was a slow, arduous process. There were days of incredible progress, where Burden would allow Ethan to saddle him, to walk him in calm, trusting circles. And there were days of heartbreaking setbacks, where a sudden noise or a shadow would send the horse into a panicked frenzy, undoing weeks of work in a matter of seconds. Through it all, Clara's faith never wavered. When Ethan's frustration boiled over, she was his calm. When his old despair threatened to consume him, she was his hope. They spent every waking moment together, their lives revolving around the healing of this magnificent broken animal. In the long hours of the afternoon, they would work together, their movements falling into a natural, unspoken rhythm. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, their bodies tired, but their spirits connected. It was during these quiet evenings that their own healing truly began. He would tell her stories of Lila, not of her death, but of her life, her laughter, her dreams. And in sharing his grief, he found it beginning to lessen its hold on him. She, in turn, told him of her own quiet loneliness on the vast ranch, of her dreams of a life filled with partnership and shared purpose. They were two lonely souls, finding in each other a kindred spirit, a safe harbor for their own unspoken burdens. The moment their love was finally acknowledged was as quiet and as natural as the setting Sunday. After a particularly difficult day of training, Ethan was ready to give up. Burden had thrown him, and his old injuries ached with a phantom pain. He sat in the dust, the picture of defeat. Clara simply walked over, sat down beside him, and took his hand. She didn't say anything. She just held it. He looked at her, at the unwavering belief in her eyes, and in that moment he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of a deep, profound gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement of the love that had grown between them, as steady and as patient as his training of the horse. Their love became the final, crucial ingredient in the horse's healing. Burden, sensing the calm and unity between the two humans he trusted, began to transform. The terror in his eyes was replaced by a fiery, competitive spirit. The raw, untamed power was still there, but now it was focused, channeled. He and Ethan were no longer just a man and a horse. They were a team, their minds and movements connected by an invisible thread of absolute trust. As the day of the race drew near, the entire ranch held its breath. They were a long shot, a broken man, and a devil horse. But Clara and Ethan, watching Burden thunder across the pasture, his powerful legs eating up the ground, his black coat gleaming in the sun, knew they were witnessing something more than just a horse learning to run. They were witnessing a soul learning to fly. They were not just training for a race. They were training for redemption. The day of the territorial derby arrived, thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and nervous energy. The stands were packed with a roaring crowd, a sight that sent a jolt of painful memory through Ethan. This was the world that had made him and the world that had broken him. As he led Burden towards the starting line, the whispers followed them. "That's the devil horse," they murmured. "And that's Cole Younger, the man who killed his own sister." The weight of their judgment was a heavy, suffocating cloak. Burden, sensing the tension of the crowd, the unfamiliar chaos, began to grow agitated. His eyes rolling, his powerful body trembling. For a terrifying moment, Ethan feared the old trauma would take hold. But then, Clara was there. She pushed through the officials, her face a beacon of calm in the storm. She went not to Ethan, but to the horse. She placed a hand on Burden's muzzle and whispered to him, her voice a low, soothing melody. The great horse instantly calmed, leaning into her touch, drawing strength from her unwavering presence. She then turned to Ethan, her eyes shining with a love and belief that silenced all the noise of the crowd. "This is not about them. This is about you. Ride for Lila, ride for yourself, come home to me." And then they were off. The race was a brutal, thundering whirlwind of chaos. Burden, a creature of the wild, was not a trained racehorse. He was bigger, stronger, and less disciplined than the sleek thoroughbreds he ran against. In the first turn, boxed in by other riders, his old panic flared. He reared, losing precious ground. The crowd groaned. It seemed their impossible gamble was lost before it had even truly begun. But Ethan did not fight him. He did not whip him. He leaned forward, his voice a low, urgent murmur against the horse's ear. Not a command, but a plea. He spoke of trust, of partnership, of the open pastures waiting for them at home. And Burden responded. He was no longer just a horse with a rider. He and Ethan were one being, a single entity fueled by a shared, desperate need for redemption. On the final stretch, it was a breathtaking sight. The giant black stallion, once a chained and broken beast, now ran with the heart of a champion. He stretched out his powerful legs, his hooves thundering against the earth, devouring the ground between him and the lead horse. They were neck and neck, a battle of wills, a fight to the very last inch. They crossed the finish line in a blur of dust and glory, the crowd roaring, unsure of who had won. And then the judge's flag went up. They had won. By a nose. Ethan, gasping for breath, slumped over the horse's neck, not in triumph, but in a wave of pure, overwhelming emotional release. He had done it. He had faced the ghosts of his past and had not been broken. He had ridden his burden not to victory, but to freedom. The real victory, however, was not the prize money that had just saved the ranch. It was the moment he slid from the saddle and Clara ran into his arms. In front of the entire, cheering crowd, he kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that sealed their future and washed away the last of his pain. He was no longer a broken man. He was a champion again, and he was home. 1 year later, the Jensen Ranch was more prosperous than ever, its future secure. But it was no longer just the Jensen Ranch. It was the Thorn Ranch now. Ethan and Clara were married, their partnership in life as strong and as seamless as it was in work. One warm summer evening, they stood by the fence of a large, green pasture, watching the magnificent black stallion. He was no longer called Burden. He was a symbol not of what was lost, but of what had been found. His name was now Redemption. He ran, not on a dusty track for the roar of a crowd, but for the sheer joy of it, his powerful legs carrying him across the open land. And running beside him was a young, spirited foal, a promise of a new generation, a new beginning. Ethan wrapped his arm around his wife, his heart full. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the heaviest burdens are not meant to be carried alone, but to be shared, to be healed, and ultimately, to be set free. If this story of redemption and second chances moved you, click the video on your screen now for another unforgettable tale from the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us which part of the story you loved most in the comments below. Your support is our greatest prize.